In April 2026, Universal Music Group announced it would sell half of its equity stake in Spotify. The transaction is worth approximately $1.4 billion. A portion of that money is now being paid out in cash to thousands of musicians who had absolutely no part in negotiating the deal that made it possible. They will receive that money even if they still owe Universal Music Group millions in unrecouped advances. They will receive it even if they have never had a hit record. They will receive it even if they are no longer signed to the label. And they will receive it because in 2018, one artist sat across the table from the world's largest record company and refused to sign a contract until one specific clause was added.
From Taylor Swift's groundbreaking new record deal to Mariah Carey's Glitter album from 2001 climbing the charts,
her name is Taylor Swift. This is not a story about pop music. It is a story about contract architecture, ownership leverage, and how a single line of legal text can quietly transfer over $1 billion of value from a corporation to the people who actually make its product. And to understand why this matters, you have to understand what the music industry has been doing to artists for the last 40 years. Chapter 1. The leverage.
Because you guys want to know about a big stake sale for Universal Music Group and how Taylor Swift's so-called Spotify clause is helping artists get paid.
In 2018, Taylor Swift was the most commercially valuable musician on earth. Her previous album, Reputation, had sold over 4.5 million equivalent units worldwide. Her tours were generating hundreds of millions of dollars per cycle, and her contract with her former label, Big Machine Records, was about to expire. This was the negotiating window, the moment when the asymmetry between artist and label briefly inverts. Most musicians never experience this moment because most musicians never reach the level of revenue where the label needs them more than they need the label. Swift had reached it. According to Billboard and The Hollywood Reporter, Swift signed a new deal in November 2018 with Universal Music Group's Republic Records. The financial terms were never publicly disclosed, but one specific provision was. Swift announced it herself on Instagram the same day the deal was signed. She wrote that as part of her new contract, she had asked that any future sale of Universal's Spotify shares result in a distribution of money to all Universal artists. And critically, she asked that the distribution be non-recoupable. That word, non-recoupable, is the entire story. Chapter 2. Recoupment. To understand what Swift demanded, you have to understand how a standard major label record deal actually works. The structure is almost universal across the industry and almost universally misunderstood by the public. When a label signs an artist, it pays an advance. That advance is not a salary. It is a loan, secured against the artist's future earnings. The label also pays for the cost of recording the album, the marketing budget, the promotional tours, the music video production, and dozens of other expenses related to launching the artist's career. Every one of those expenses is added to the artist's account at the label. The artist's royalties from album sales, streaming revenue, and licensing income are then used to pay back that account. Until the account is fully repaid, the artist is described in industry terminology as unrecouped. According to multiple music industry analyses, including reporting from Music Business Worldwide.
According to Spotify, Taylor Swift is the first female artist in the streamer's history to reach 100 million monthly listeners.
Wow. The vast majority of major label artists never recoup. Some estimates place the figure at over 80%. They generate revenue, they tour, they sell merchandise, but on paper, they remain in debt to their label for the entirety of their career. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The label keeps the proceeds from the artist's work until the loan is repaid. If the loan is never repaid, the label keeps the proceeds indefinitely. Now consider what happens when a separate, unrelated revenue stream lands on the label's balance sheet. For example, the proceeds from selling its equity in Spotify. In a standard contract, those proceeds belong to the label. The label has no obligation to share them with artists, and if the label voluntarily decides to share them, it can deduct any amounts owed against the artist's unrecouped balance. The artist receives nothing because technically they still owe. That is the rule Swift refused to accept. Chapter 3. The precedent. Universal Music Group was not the first major label to face this question. The pattern had already been established 2 years earlier. According to Music Business Worldwide, in 2016, Sony Music Group and Warner Music Group both publicly committed to sharing proceeds from any future Spotify stock sales with their artists. There was no legal requirement for them to do this. It was a voluntary commitment. Spotify went public in April 2018. Sony sold a portion of its Spotify stake almost immediately after the IPO. Warner sold its entire Spotify stake several months later. Both labels honored their commitments and paid out hundreds of millions of dollars to their artist rosters. But the methods were different in one crucial way. Sony paid artists regardless of whether their accounts were recouped. Every Sony artist received a check. Warner did not. Warner only paid artists whose accounts were already in the black, meaning artists who had already paid back their advances and recording costs in full. The unrecouped artists at Warner, which statistically was most of them, received nothing. This was widely reported across the music industry trade press at the time. The Sony approach was viewed as artist-friendly. The Warner approach was viewed as a structural transfer of artist money back to the label. Universal had publicly pledged in March 2018 to also share proceeds from any future Spotify sale, but Universal had not specified which method it would use, Sony's approach or Warner's. That is the gap Swift identified, and that is the gap her clause closed. Chapter 4. The clause. When Swift signed with Universal in November 2018, she negotiated a specific contractual provision requiring that any future distribution from a Spotify share sale be paid to artists on a non-recoupable basis. In financial terms, this means the payout cannot be deducted from the artist's outstanding balance with the label. The artist receives the money in full, regardless of whether they owe Universal money on their record deal. In practical terms, this means an artist who signed a $1 million advance has earned back only $200,000 and still owes Universal $800,000 on paper will still receive a check from the Spotify sale. That check does not get netted against the $800,000. It is paid out separately in cash. This is the structural detail that most coverage of the story has missed. The clause did not just mean Swift would get paid. Swift would have been paid either way. The clause meant that every other Universal artist, including the vast majority who are unrecouped and would have received nothing under the Warner model, would now also be paid. Swift used her negotiating leverage at her own contract signing to force the label to apply the more generous methodology to its entire roster, not just to her. According to The Hollywood Reporter, this was, in their words, the sort of move only an artist of her stature could make a reality. Chapter 5. The Trigger.
Puerto Rican superstar Bad Bunny has been named the global top artist for the fourth time with nearly 20 billion streams. As you see on your screen, Taylor Swift, The Weeknd, Drake, and Billie Eilish round out the top 5.
For 7 years, the clause sat dormant. Universal owned approximately 3.16% of Spotify, equivalent to roughly 6.5 million shares, according to Universal's 2025 annual report. Spotify's share price climbed steadily through 2023, 2024, and 2025. By April 2026, Spotify shares were trading at approximately $443 each. Universal's full stake was now worth approximately $2.8 billion. And then, on April 29, 2026, Universal Music Group made an announcement. Speaking to investors during its first quarter earnings results, Universal confirmed it would sell half of its Spotify stake. According to Bloomberg and Music Business Worldwide, the sale would generate approximately $1.4 billion in proceeds. Universal stated that it would direct its share toward an expanded share buyback program totaling €1 billion. In its official statement, Universal said, consistent with the company's approach to artist compensation, artists will share in the proceeds. The clause Swift had inserted 7 years earlier had now been activated. It is impossible at this stage to know exactly how much of the $1.4 billion will reach artists. The label keeps a portion. Distribution is calculated according to each artist's contract terms. But the structure Swift forced into existence ensures that the majority of those artists, including the unrecouped majority, receive a payment they would not have received under the alternative methodology. Chapter 6. The backstory. To understand why Swift had this specific clause prepared and ready to deploy in 2018, you have to understand what happened in 2014. In November 2014, Swift removed her entire catalogue from Spotify. She did this in the middle of one of the biggest album launches of her career, refusing to allow her album 1989 to be streamed on the platform for over 2.5 years. At the time, Swift wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal titled, For Taylor Swift, the future of music is a love story. In it, she argued that the streaming model, as it existed, did not adequately compensate artists for the value of their work. She returned her catalogue to Spotify in June 2017, but the gesture had already established something important. Swift had publicly demonstrated that she understood the streaming economics, that she was willing to walk away from substantial revenue to make a point about artist compensation, and that she had the leverage to do it. When she sat down to negotiate her Universal contract a year later, that history was the foundation. The Spotify clause was not improvised. It was the deliberate, prepared outcome of a multi-year strategy to position herself as the artist who would force the system to work differently. That is what financial leverage looks like in practice. Not just the ability to demand a higher advance, the ability to alter the structural terms under which an entire industry operates. Chapter 7. The Ownership Architecture. The Spotify clause is one piece of a much larger ownership architecture that Swift has spent the better part of a decade constructing. Following her departure from Big Machine Records and the subsequent sale of her original master recordings to investor Scooter Braun in 2019, Swift undertook one of the most ambitious projects in modern music history. She re-recorded her first 6 studio albums, releasing them as the so-called Taylor's Version series. The financial logic of this project is precise. Sync licensing, placing songs in films, advertisements, and television shows, is one of the highest margin revenue streams in the music business. By creating new master recordings that she fully owns, Swift redirected sync revenue away from the entity that had purchased her originals and toward her own catalogue. According to multiple industry estimates, the re-recordings have collectively generated hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue, the majority of which flows to her ownership structure rather than to a third party. Swift's Eras tour, which concluded in 2024, generated over $2 billion in gross revenue, according to Pollstar, the highest-grossing tour of all time. The tour merchandise, the concert film distributed by AMC Theatres, and the associated streaming bumps are all structured to maximise her direct ownership. This is the framework. Every revenue stream is engineered so that the dominant share flows to entities Swift controls. Royalties, master recordings, touring, merchandise, sync licensing, and now, by extension, the equity proceeds from her label's investment in a streaming platform. The Spotify clause is not an isolated act of advocacy. It is a single component in a vertically integrated business model designed to capture the maximum possible portion of every dollar generated by her work. Chapter 8. The Wider Lesson. There is a broader pattern here that applies far beyond Taylor Swift. According to Billboard, the music industry has historically operated on a structure that concentrates ownership of catalogues, master recordings, and ancillary revenue rights with labels and distributors, while artists receive a percentage of the income their work generates after deductions. The percentage varies, the deductions vary, but the underlying architecture has been remarkably stable for the last 50 years. The artists who break out of this pattern are the ones who treat their careers as a business model from the beginning, rather than as a creative pursuit with business obligations attached. They negotiate ownership rather than fees. They demand equity rather than royalty bumps. They structure deals where the revenue compounds over time rather than depleting on a per-project basis. Prince fought Warner Brothers for decades over ownership of his masters. He famously appeared in public with the word slave written on his face. He changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol in protest. He died in 2016, having only partially recovered control of his catalogue. Swift took the same fight, and instead of waging it publicly through symbolic protest, she resolved it structurally through contract architecture. The re-recordings, the universal deal, the Spotify clause. Each of these was a financial mechanism designed to convert leverage into permanent ownership. This is the playbook that every elite creator economy participant is now studying. Not because Taylor Swift writes the best songs, although she sells more albums than anyone alive, but because she has demonstrated, in dollars, that the highest leverage move in the modern music business is not getting a better royalty rate. It is owning the underlying architecture that the royalty flows through. Chapter 9. What happens next? The Universal Spotify sale is not the end of this story. According to Bloomberg, billionaire investor Bill Ackman made an unsolicited $64 billion bid for Universal Music Group in early April 2026. As part of that proposal, Ackman suggested selling Universal's entire remaining Spotify stake and using 1.5 billion euros of the proceeds to fund both the takeover and additional artist compensation. If that scenario plays out, the second half of Universal's Spotify stake will also be liquidated. And under the terms of Swift's clause, that would trigger a second, equally large distribution to Universal artists. The clause, in other words, does not pay out once, it pays out every time Universal sells Spotify equity in perpetuity. Until Universal has sold its entire stake, the mechanism remains active. This is the difference between a one-time win and a financial structure. Swift did not just secure a single payout for herself. She built a recurring distribution mechanism that benefits her entire industry every time a specific corporate event occurs. If you find these breakdowns useful, the kind that explain how revenue actually moves through ownership structures rather than just how the headlines sound, IconCapital exists to help you see these mechanics clearly. The contracts beneath the brands, the valuations beneath the names, the business architecture that determines who actually keeps the money. If that is the kind of analysis you want more of, subscribing makes sure you do not miss the next breakdown. Because in the end, the music business has always rewarded the artists who can write the songs. But it transfers ownership to the artists who can read the contract. Taylor Swift did both. And on April 29, 2026, an entire industry of musicians who never met her received the proof of what that combination is actually worth.